going to do another use case, although this is a kind of robust use case involving biomedical resource creation, biopharmaceuticals, and digital health. And it's, as with the last panel, it's a use case where there is a potential for a significant risk, as contrasted with the morning panel, which just involved patents and IP, where the risk would only be to, I suppose, somebody's profit margin. So an important panel, and we've got some great people to discuss the issues. I'm going to not really, you have their bios in the brochure, so I'm not really going to go through their extremely impressive and extensive bios. I'll just note the order in which they're speaking, and both I and Nita Farahany, who spoke earlier, are going to probably ask questions after they speak. We also have participating by phone somebody from the FDA, whom I will introduce after I introduce our main speakers. So John Daley and Julie Daughtry are from Watson Health, and you've already heard, I'm sure before you came to this conference, a lot about Watson. So Watson Health is obviously a important figure in the AI and health space. Then we'll have Samir, and you actually have also already heard about the National Library of Medicine from Marjorie, who commended NLM for all of its great work in the AI space. And then finally, in terms of people who are here, you'll hear from Nicholson Price, who is a really fabulous young scholar who has a PhD in some of these areas and is also a law professor. So we have a very talented panel. And then on the line, we have Dr. Dinesh Patwardhan from the FDA, who is going to give some comments after these folks speak, and then we will have some questions, and then we'll open up for discussion. So, John and Julia.
Okay, so I'm Julie Daughtry, and just to give you a little bit of distinction between the two of us, I'm in the legal department for IBM Watson to Health, whereas John is our VP for Quality and Regulatory Affairs. We're going to share this presentation, but really I'm not even going to speak to these charts very much because a lot of them we've covered, but I think what's really happened, even though the theme of today's conference was AI and the administrative state, I think the sub-theme throughout everything we've had today is really what is responsible tech, right? What does that mean? What does that look like? And that's a theme that I think has come up again and again. And it's something I love to talk about. So I'm going to use my charts a little bit, and really I'm hoping to talk about, how we think about responsible tech at IBM. So the first thing, just to give a high-level overview if people don't know about Watson is what we call a cognitive system. It essentially learns and adapts, it does machine learning, and it does natural language processing. And some people may remember that, we talked earlier about narrow AI. Well, what's the first use case we trained Watson for? We taught it to play Jeopardy. And that was our use case. And so I was actually the lawyer for IBM Research when Watson was being created. And so the days of negotiating the Jeopardy contract was very exciting. But what was really, really interesting and what we were trying to prove in that use case was really that Watson could take in enormous volumes of information across a multitude of subjects, learn something about them, but also understand natural language and the way humans speak, right? Could it understand the irony of the way a question is worded in Jeopardy? Could it understand how to weight the answers? And luckily, we went on national TV and didn't totally embarrass ourselves. So it was very exciting for all of us who were sort of there at the birth of Watson. So machine learning, I think we've already talked a lot about this. I'm going to skip over. I mean, we focus usually on sort of 3 types of tasks: regression, classification, and clustering. But in general, we're trying to give computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And there's supervised learning and unsupervised learning, as well as reinforcement. Again, I think most people in the room covered a lot of this. This chart is the high-level process of how we think about going through to train our models and coming up with a result. This looks a lot, frankly, like Ian's chart, right? On how do you get to your model, how do you get to your result. I'm going to focus on the data piece of this because I think what we heard a lot about was how do we know what companies are doing with data? So from an IBM perspective, when we think about responsible tech in this area, we have three main data principles that we focus on. So we have a purpose, we talk about transparency, and then we talk about skills. And so from a purpose perspective, we actually talk about AI and we call it augmented intelligence, because for us, it's about giving insights and supporting what humans do. It's not about replacing them. And we've heard all day long about this really being a partnership between human and the computer. It's not just let's all walk away and computers are going to run the world. So you will hear us refer to augmented intelligence quite a bit. For transparency, we really focus on our clients' data is their data. And we talk about a glass box and full transparency being around how our systems are trained, the corpus of information being used, and the knowledge upon which recommendations are made. So from that perspective, I mean, listen, I hear people today talking about maybe you need to show your source code, right? Goodness, and that makes tech companies, hair curl. Okay, right? But what we really think is, when you think about explainability or transparency, what do people really need to see? We have a lot of really smart people in the room, and some of you are technologists. But I still think most of us, if somebody threw a piece of source code in front of us, it would mean nothing to us, right? So what do people really want to know? So we would say things like, with Watson for Oncology, if you go to your doctor and they're going to use Watson for Oncology to look at some weighted recommendations of treatments for your particular type of cancer, what do you want to know? Well, you want to know who trained it. Well, we're very clear. Memorial Sloan Kettering trained Watson for Oncology. We're not trying to hide it. We didn't get some random guy off the internet who said he knows something about cancer. We're very specific about who trained it. With Watson for Genomics, where your genetic data can be run through a system and we can pull from a vast amount of research literature possible options that might help with your particular genetic variant that you have for a particular disease, the doctor who's looking at that can click on the information and see all the research studies that are leading to that result. So they can see there was a research study in France with 300 patients, and this is what it showed, as they use that clinical decision support software to consider that possible treatment for you as the individual. And you probably want to know that, yeah, your doctor could actually look at the research study, and again, we didn't just pick some wacky study off the internet that someone made up, right? So we think about transparency in the context of, what does the end user really want to know? And most doctors and most patients don't really want a copy of the source code. That's not very interesting to them. Now, in other contexts, there may be situations where source code is really interesting and tech companies will figure out what to do about that. But we really focus on, how are we training the system? What's the corpus of information and knowledge upon which the recommendations are made? And then for skills, our third data principle, our focus is the fact that, again, AI systems are being trained and support human professionals, and it leads to new skills and what we call new collar jobs. And again, you will hear again and again us talk about the fact that, if you listen to any of our top leadership at IBM, they're going to tell you, we're not going to replace all the jobs, but we're actually going to change how most jobs are done. That's what's going to happen with AI. It's going to change how jobs are done, but it's not going to replace all the jobs. So that's kind of our data principles and how we think about responsible tech in this area. I know that's not healthcare specific, but given all the questions and things, I just thought it made a lot of sense to kind of lay out how at least IBM thinks about responsible tech in this area. And I'm going to turn this over now for our...
So, again, putting this together before actually being at the seminar, this is geared towards thought of, you have new techniques, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and folks want to focus immediately on what's really new and scary. But it's also important to focus on what exists that can actually help you with this new technology. So this was to illustrate there are a lot of existing framework and schema that can be used to help get us to a good place with the use of machine learning, cognitive computing in any of the applications we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So we have our standard design and development wheel, and then anyone who's familiar with my space of either pharmacovigilance, pharmaceutical law, or medical device law, these are all from the Code of Federal Regulations, the quality system regulations, the various stage gates that products must go through to come to market. So machine learning can apply to all of these, and you can talk about what we're trying to do, and we'll talk about some of those examples, is help regulators with what should they ask for, what looks like good AI. So along that, as we've said all along, and pretty much every speaker has said, the partnership between humans and the models being created and the data being used to create those models is the key thing. So we've heard the term ground truth. That's really where a lot of it starts. So you need to know the limits of your training data. And in our space, that could be the limits of ages in the training data. Perhaps there's no pediatric data. That doesn't make those data wrong. Where that would be wrong is if when you launched it, you didn't label for that, or you didn't make your users aware that, hey, if you're going to use this in a pediatric case, you need to know that goes beyond the limits of the data on which the system was trained. We have one example, and I know we're a little pressed for time, I think, on ours, but key considerations that we put in is we do try and design for transparency. So as Julie said, and I'll make reference to our Watson for Patient Safety offering that we're partnering with Celgene on, we're making it, it's very modular. So people think of AI, and this has been said many times, which is good because our themes all reinforce. People will think the patient safety application is to help automate the filing of adverse events for pharmaceutical companies. So when someone calls and says, my patient took Tylenol and they developed a rash and they give some things, can that be automated, put into a database, and then classified as, is this a reportable adverse event? And oh, by the way, in the background, we'll track this and say, okay, this was expected, it's within normal levels, or, oh my word, we've gotten 300 calls for this in the past week, that's abnormal, what's going on? So within that, as Julie said, we provide, when the system is doing that and extracting the information from whether this is reportable, not reportable, severe, not severe, it's highlighted right to the user, the sections that the system used to base its judgment on. Was it reportable, and what was the reportable event? So they can always second guess it. And then finally, ground truth, we mentioned that again, but I'll turn it over to Samir so we can circle back. To me, that's one thing I talk to folks about, is you are only as good as where you start. So those ground truth data, you need to make sure you fully understand them and understand their limits. And that's why I say having limits doesn't make it bad. It's only bad if you don't realize you have those limits. Another example would be Watson for oncology. Perhaps a physician out in the field has a 92-year-old patient with cancer and they want to see what Memorial Sloan Kettering would recommend. The training data may not have had a lot of nonagenarians, I guess. That's neither right nor wrong. What's important is that the system lets people know, hey, for this age, you're beyond the standard training set. Please interpret these results with caution. That way you don't get, as I forget which one of the panelists prior, you don't get over faith in the system and just blindly go along. And I think that's me. And I mentioned those are the two key things. The other is our training data. You want to make sure it's machine readable. I warn everyone of that. It won't be as readable as you thought it was. It's going to take you a heck of a lot longer than you thought. So prepare your timelines accordingly. And we're not yet ready for questions, but Samir.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So Samir Antani, National Library of Medicine. I'm an intramural scientist there, working in image analysis and machine learning topics. And yes, the library does work with images, even though it was initially text, but images are information, and it recognized that very early. So I've been working on that for nearly a decade and a half there now. So my areas, I threw in a bunch of pictures because this spread tells you not just the specific topics that I and my team are leading and working on, is you're looking at signal data on the brain side, and it has a different type of 3D plus signal analysis work, and its notion of truth is, or what we'd call truth, is varies than somebody who has, let's say, tuberculosis or any pulmonary disease in the chest x-rays, where you are much more spatially cognizant of where the disease might be. And if you get into histologic or microscopic data, there the questions being posed of these images is of a different nature. You get into cervical cancer, and there even the experts disagree where to biopsy. So you have that situation, and then you get into medical literature that PubMed Central, for example, hosts, where you have text and images together, which would be a fount of knowledge to be able to combine text and images, and I know Google does some of that as well for the web at large. But where we're trying to get to is, where's the space of question answering? Are you really doing retrieval of information that just matched a term that you were looking for, or are you indeed actually answering the question that was posed by the user? And where is the intelligence in that? And that's the general spread of my work so they will tell you that I'm pretty much deep in the trenches with this kind of work, and it informs some of my thinking that I want to say here, and it'll overlap heavily with what John has already said, and some of you have said in the past during the day here. So I just put my thoughts on what do I want AI to be, and my first thought is I want to be awesome. I want it to be there. I'm a technophile. I like for it to help and make my life better. But that's the whole point, that if you want to make it better, then what are the considerations that would enable me to trust this device? And what would I want to ask myself as a researcher, what I should reveal, and how much can I reveal? And then of course, there are the considerations that the corporate world may not want to do or should do, and that's where the discussion really lies. You want to be transparent, and transparency is different for different groups of people. For users, I don't want to know AI is there. I just want it to be around me and should solve my problems. And I should be what I am, not having to worry about it. Yet it's my valet, if you will, always there. But as a regulator or a critic or a cynic, you want to know what's going on beneath the surface. Really get and visualizations of these deep learning layers are mechanisms in that direction. They're not really it, because they all suggest that the question you're building the system for was what it was highlighting for you. But then, are you asking the right question? And that's the whole track. You want to reproduce the results with different tweaks of the same data set, and that tends to be a problem in most published literature. When I review papers, you see that you get the best run, but that's not the typical run. And of course, generally you don't find people explaining how the algorithms really work, or even an intuition of how they really work. And that's where the big gaps really are. And this last topic of improving existing processes, I think somebody touched on that implicitly in the previous session also, is that are we trying to just plug in AI to be around and solve our existing processes? What if our processes are already bad? And how would you want to improve those processes so that the AI can do better? And so the question is, are we want to be in the same frame mindset or not? And then I began jotting down things that I would look at from a sense of what goes into making a good AI machine learning algorithm, if you will. And it applies to, from a medical standpoint, is acquisition QA. A lot of times these algorithms are built on pre-existing data sets, which means that you had no control as a machine learning AI person on how the images were acquired and would they be acquired in the same way. Now for radiology, the problem is generally much more constrained because these devices are designed to build acquire images in a fixed way. But when you get to optical images, skin lesions, cervicography, looking at cervical cancer, or endoscopy, the variability is very broad, and what you may have trained for that one small subset doesn't necessarily extend, even though the algorithm does. And then which sensor did you use? Did you use this generation camera, or the pixels go up? And how did the white point of your light source change? So if you have images from cervical cancer acquired 15 years ago on Ektachrome slides that we have scanned, and they used warm light, 3400 Kelvin light white point. While now these cell phones have 6,000, 6,500 Kelvin, the white points is much bluer. So the tissue color changes, and if your algorithms are color dependent, then you're going to get a different outcome. And as you move forward, are these going to sustain in the? And then of course the question of variety is: are we modeling prevalence into our data sets? We as a population, we are healthy, so the numbers of samples that are abnormal are much smaller, and yet our decision points at 50% usually. And you say, well, are we really modeling prevalence into the decision making? Should we be much more specific in our decision and then model sensitivity for let's say a population study, for example? And of course, how large was the unit that you worked with? Is it just that one image, a series of images, images plus time, so the patient record was available to you? And how sparse was it in terms of the population at large? I'll skip over the relevance because you answered it previously about general AI versus narrow AI, and which kinds of images you're using. If you're going across modalities, if you're going radiology plus something else, then again, all of the above kind of intermingle and apply with this as well. And is it a clean data set that was meant for? This is a computer science peeve that I have. I'm a computer scientist by training, and the common problem is that we work with clean, pristine data sets so we can produce a fantastic algorithm, get a paper, get published, get out in the workforce. The real world data is dirty, and I come back to machines not talking to each other and having holes because humans are very good at making assessments and don't necessarily have to fill that gap and move on. And so we have that large data sets, very interesting, full of holes, and then you're going to fix them. Units are off and such. Then there's a question of what were you trying to do with your method? Are you detecting disease, or are you staging or prognosis? Are you applying a prognosis for a person who is coming in trying to do a predictive analysis on their, or are you merely creating an alerting system for it, and that probably apply more to a population, for example, rather than an individual. And what is the goal of your black box AI algorithm? Is it going to be a tool for a clinician, just so they can? So one comment I was making earlier today was, and which also is a thought among the radiology workspaces, that you see lots of papers and claims that machines are beating radiology, and they're out of a job soon. And really speaking, is what are we really building? These are series of narrow AIs that are outperforming humans on very specific narrow tasks. So you can step back and say, well, what is the role of a radiologist now? Is he or she going to be looking at these various inputs and then making a diagnostician's comment on these various sensors? Is he or she in a cockpit now and looking at these sensors like you would be flying a plane? So planes don't fly themselves, well, drones could do now. But even so, is that the new model? We will have multiple narrow sensors. They all do individually very well, but collectively somebody else has to sit and decide. So, and then the question is, what are the roles of the validators? So I'll jump a topic and go into the role of statistics. And interestingly enough, in one of my own works for malaria screening, we had a fairly high number of samples of cells that we're trying to say, so binary goal: has parasite, has no parasite. Very, very simple problem, on the surface at least. And we began throttling the data that we released to the learning algorithm, increasing in small segments. So some frameworks hit a high point, and you can say, well, this one's doing really well, the rest of them are doing badly. Fine. As we gave more data to the others and stopped starting them, this didn't change much at all. So it had reached its optimal learning point. The others, however, came up to a point where they were not statistically significantly different anymore. It was just within the very narrow variability. So the question is that, do these models, are they conditional to the kinds of and the amount of samples they have seen? And have we seen enough samples for the problem that we're trying to ask of these models? And question is, if these AIs become complex and we are having a system from an engineer standpoint, a system of AIs that are put together, how would we evaluate all of these in this space? And that's some of the things that we have I've begun to look at, because I've begun to realize that many of the methods that we're looking at are not one classifier, but many classifiers that are put together with automated weighting of these various layers. I've gone over some of this in interest of time. I'm going to skip this, but the idea is in terms of revealing how much non-private data do we need to reveal to the regulators so that we can still convince them that the method is behaving as well as it is. Because the corporate world may have controls, and there may be PHI controls for privacy information, where you do not reveal too much data, but you can reveal enough that reflects the model's behavior at large. And that comes back into transparency in model design and the data used and such. This last topic on GPU hardware and development platform hit us more recently when one of the Python libraries changed from 3.4 to 5. Half the code stopped working. The other half began giving us different results. So we began to realize that, hang on, if we are in flux at the moment, we're already talking about rolling this out, then should the version that was used be frozen at some point? If open source software is being used in devices, should these companies be revealing that? And then so we know what the operating parameter. It's fine what it is, but if it behaves such and such and you met all the other previous requirements, but then is it frozen? And if you change it, are we going to reevaluate? Should the approvals from regulatory standpoint be versions? So you get a license for 3 years until you change your version again. I don't know. And data augmentation, because we don't have enough samples of images, we have been machine learning AI people, will augment the data, twist and turn the image around or play with the words in the records to create more samples for training. Now, are these modifications really reflecting the way disease is? Are actually exhibiting? So just because you can move pixels around doesn't mean that represents the way disease expresses itself. I had a problem with some of my EE and computer science postdocs trying to work with chest X-ray images, and they began moving pixels around. And well, we have an anatomy in our chest. We cannot have certain things happening in certain parts of the chest. So you cannot create, just because you can create a shadow in a different part of the chest doesn't mean it will happen. No, it's a lobe, and it's not going to happen, sorry. So getting them aligned and getting them working. So again, but these papers are being published and are being reviewed. And the question is, are we asking these questions of our researchers? So this is some of me beating on myself a little, and my team also, but also seeing the scoping of the science at large, is that when two different domains work together, one needs to be sensitive to what area one is applying these AI techniques to. And that applies to, again, how you will tweak and modify the data. This is, of course, on how you will be using it. Again, it overlaps. How is it going to be a part of the clinical workflow? Does it meet the standards that are being used already there? Does it talk to other devices? And will that decision sustain itself? What if the decision is a probabilistic decision versus a hard concrete decision? Where are you polling the method for? And finally, end user training. Eventually, if a doctor decides, or a nurse decides, or a healthcare worker decides that I took this action, and let's say it has a minimal adverse reaction, but I did because, well, the AI said so. And in your training, you were told, don't look for this. It was clearly off for that small sample of population. Then, in time, how do you constantly re-educate them to not give up their own sense of intelligence just because a machine is saying? This happened to us with a group we are working with in China. They were TB hospital. They have been very gracious with sharing some of their images with us. And we wanted them to try out more of our classified examples, just so you have a set that's been read already, and you reread it once again through my classifier. And they actually began, I was wrong. In the examples they shared with us, the machine was wrong. And they actually began doubting themselves. And that was the point, that with years of training, being in a TB hospital, seeing TB patients, they still doubted themselves and said the machine must be right. And that actually totally shook my foundations. And hang on, we as humans are beginning to completely ignore what we have learned just because the machine is saying something. And that's something to do with our trust in technology. And I come back to my original comment about AI being awesome. Is I want it to be awesome, and how does it impact my decision? And this is again, what John referred to is continuous learning in AI. We have reinforcement learning, and how does it impact the decision making? Does it learn more? Does it learn less? In fact, did we not recently discover a new category that we did not know about? And how does that loop back into the use of these techniques? So with that, I leave it open to you and pass it on to Nicholson.
Thanks. So I'm gonna I'm gonna step upwards maybe 10 or 20,000 feet because I don't have a whole lot in the way of the practical expertise. I haven't developed machine learning systems like these folks have. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of how FDA treats AI applications, and I kind of want to talk about a narrative of what this has been looking like and how rapidly things seem to have been changing at the agency. So if you asked me 3 years ago, I want to talk about how FDA does it and then how we deal with incentives and changing AI. If you asked me 5 years ago how FDA was going to treat AI, I would say, well, we've got a pretty good idea. We've got this 2014 guidance where FDA specifically said that for diagnostic tests, if it's non-transparent, we think that's going to be basically the highest risk kind of medical device. That's going to be a class 3 medical device. And we're going to say that's going to require pre-market approval and clinical trials, and this is going to be hard. And then that never quite got finalized. And in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act passed, and it seemed to be going along kind of the same lines, at least a little bit, where it said, okay, this act said, if you have clinical decision support software, if the doctor not actually does, but can review how the software is making its recommendations or decisions, then it actually doesn't count as a medical device at all. And FDA doesn't review it at all. But if it's non-transparent, which AI would seem mostly to be, at least in this sense of saying you can review the reasoning of it, not always, but often, then FDA is going to review it and going to review it more strictly. And this may be pretty nervous, right? Because the traditional way of regulating new medical technology assumes some things that AI seems not to be, right? The traditional way is clinical trials, and those tend to be expensive and slow and around large numbers rather than kind of individualized things. And perhaps most important, they tend to envision static products, which is to say you develop a drug and it doesn't really change, or you develop a medical device and it doesn't change a whole lot. But if you're developing an AI to do something, we hope that that will keep changing quite a bit as we add more data and as we continuously improve and we just make this better. Like the process of machine learning should continue. So that model didn't seem to work very well. And some people that thought about this, certainly me, were at least a little bit nervous that this was going to be kind of over-regulated and we were going to stifle innovation, all that kind of stuff. And that seems not to have happened, and the change seems to be happening pretty rapidly. I'm reading tea leaves a little bit here because we haven't gotten a whole lot of this, but we've gotten 3 AI machine learning devices approved in the last, year and a half. I think that's all of them. And none of them have actually gone through this really intensive class 3 pre-market approval pathway. Instead, FDA seems to be taking them kind of one case at a time, and it's going through a lighter process. And in fact, and it feels very funny to be talking at an academic conference about kind of what can we glean from tweets. But Scott Gottlieb, it turns out, is big on, who runs the FDA, is big on Twitter and has been tweeting about the fact that actually we would like to see more AI devices, and we're thinking that it behaves a lot like regular software, and maybe we're gonna go with this kind of pre-certification model where you say, well, Watson, you seem pretty smart. We trust you guys. You're good guys. Let's give you a little bit of
that's true.
a lighter run up front. We'll be a little more relaxed at the upfront, what you need to demonstrate, but we want more back-end surveillance. And so it seems like the agency over the course of just a few years is becoming markedly more flexible and more comfortable with this technology, which is really cool. So that's the positive part of this. Here's the bit that makes me a little bit nervous. I'm a law professor, so I can't come down on just one side of things, which is to say that idea, the idea of we'll be lighter on the front end, then we'll just be more careful on the back end. Like we'll do post-market surveillance, we'll keep watching this as it's in the market, as it's applied, as it actually works. It turns out that that's not something that FDA has historically been particularly good at. It's been kind of okay at that, but it's tough to enforce post-market commitments on drugs. It's not great at it with devices, and so this idea that once we let you on the and when things go bad, once patients are using it, they really don't want it to be withdrawn from the market. So the idea that we'll be safer on the back end once this is already out there clashes a little bit with how FDA has in the past managed to actually enforce these commitments, which leads to the question of how do we do this right? And I think at least one possibility is that this is an area where we might think, if we've got lots of expertise kind of hanging around in the world, not that it's hanging around, everybody's employed and busy, we might think that this would be an area where we could see collaborative governance or cooperative governance or other actors than just FDA taking some sort of oversight role, saying, well, hey, how well is this actually working in my hospital? Which comes in the idea of kind of end user training and making sure that what you're seeing is actually working well. And here I come to the last clash then. I think I love this idea, unsurprisingly. I've stated it to you. The challenge then is where we get with transparency and how we actually balance the transparency that we would need for that sort of kind of continuing broad-based oversight with the idea that in terms of incentives, kind of for capturing the value of goods like this, there's a pretty strong desire to keep at least some things pretty proprietary, and trade secrecy is a lovely tool for maintaining the proprietary nature of data or algorithms. And so, there's the statement, we don't want to share the source code because we don't need to share the source code. Doctors don't really want to see the source code. Agreed. But maybe we want somebody to see the source code, and if things do keep changing, and if the model parameters do keep changing over time, maybe FDA will shift and become really good at monitoring that. Maybe we can trust companies to monitor their own products enough, but maybe if we want somebody else in there, or at least the option to have other actors looking at this, we need to find some way around the trap of saying proprietary data and proprietary algorithms are the way to keep incentives and to keep market share when that seems at least potentially to clash with the regulatory kind of oversight side of things. I'm not quite sure how to work out that tension. It's possible you'll all tell me there's no tension and we're all just happy to share everything, and
that's not going to happen.
but I'm not 100% certain that you're going to say that. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to the discussion.
So I think we have Dinesh on the line. Is he on the line, Dinesh?
Hi, this is Dinesh, yeah.
Did you have any comments that you wanted to share from an FDA perspective on any of this? Dinesh is in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, which is the relevant center for most of what we've been talking about.
So first, thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. As was mentioned, I'm with the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I'm with the Office of Science and Engineering Labs. I'm going to make a couple of sort of global points first. Perhaps these are a repeat for this audience and this panel, but to set the stage, I need to make them. FDA is a regulatory agency. There are several centers, CDER and CBER and CDRH and so on. The underlying regulations were enacted over a long period of time, and so the centers work well with each other, but by design they focus on different products in different sectors. And the reason this is important, I will say in a minute. I'm a scientist within CDRH, and at some level, AI is a technology. More recently, there has been nanotechnology, additive manufacturing or 3D printing as a technology. AI as a technology is perhaps more impactful, more wider impact, more deeper impact. And from a supporting technology perspective, we are just kind of getting started. Computing power is going up and sensors are getting smaller and more accurate. Connectivity is everywhere, and software is becoming more efficient. FDA regulates medical products. FDA does not directly regulate AI. We have some experience with regulating products where underlying technology is new. So that's sort of the context I want to set this up in. For us, AI is one of these new technologies that we call digital health. And our commissioner is the lead champion of this digital health. Last year in 2017, there was a innovation plan around digital health. And for us, digital health is software, mobile medical apps, wearables, cybersecurity, cloud, wireless and devices, AI, all of them. So the challenge is the regulatory framework which was set up for physical things, cardiovascular implants, orthopedic implants, imaging, MRIs and CAT scans and X-rays and so on, all the rest. With AI, as was mentioned before, the innovation cycle is significantly faster. And so we have to be nimble and innovative as the product we are trying to regulate. So that's the challenge. Within the center, we don't make widgets. Our mission is to protect and promote public health, and patient are sort of front and center in the decisions we make. So with that sort of North Star, we want to look for safety and effectiveness in medical products that we regulate. And if some of those medical products have AI or all the rest of the things that I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, then we have to find a new way to balance the faster cycle of innovation and also patient safety. So that's the challenge we face within the agency. I will take a pause here, and I have a few more points to make, but I'll take a pause here because I cannot. I'm not in the room, so if there are any comments or should I continue, please let me know.
So That's great, Dinesh. I think, yeah, it would be great to have you participating in the conversation going forward, but I think we'll now become more interactive and everyone, both on the panel and in the audience, will have an opportunity to participate. So I'll just start with throwing out one question, which I think both you, Dinesh, and then Nicholson very explicitly noted, which is that if we are going to get the larger, say, hospital, insurance company ecosystem participating in surveillance monitoring, then as you indicated, there's probably going to have to be more distribution of information that might be considered confidential. Is that something that a trade-off you'd be willing to make at IBM Watson for faster approval on the front end?
I would think so, yeah. If you work with the agency and design what the information flows will be, that's good because it benefits your product as well. So sometimes when I speak and people talk about the ability for AI, especially in our Watson for Patient Safety example, because you can see a world we hope to get where it's not only doing faxes and texts and phone calls, but it's going out and scanning Twitter. That's one. People are very interested in the social media aspect. Can we detect the signals there where somebody tweets, I hate whatever X drug has made me lose my hair, and that's your first signal. And some folks say, I don't know if we want this because there's going to be so much more. We're busy enough as it is. Well, they're overlooking the promise of, as you may be, but if we can cull the wheat from the chaff and get true signals and get, move away all that routine stuff, you'll be the better for it. And the same thing with should be just as I think it was the automated car gentleman said. The danger is if you do with a tightly scripted, all right, here's what you must report, right? We'll design our system for that, and then we'll fight changing that because we're all comfortable. But IBM, one advantage we have, as Julie said, is we are trying to be more of an honest broker in the middle and not advocate for any one company's way of doing things within regards to using AI. We work with them to adapt to their systems. So we're very open, and in our products that we're designing for ourselves, like Watson for Oncology, that's also part of we're holding ourselves to net promoter scores. Maybe that's a total left turn, but one fear folks had was, well, these are complaints. John, you've trained, I was very happy. I've trained them on what complaints are, which is any expression of dissatisfaction. Like, well, if somebody says, I hate your product, that's a complaint. I'm like, well, yes, it is, but we have systems where we'll work that. Now, if they say, I hate your product, fine, that's a complaint, we take it. You go deal with it, marketing, figure it out. If they say, I hate your product because it, gave me a recommendation that hurt someone, I go, well, now we will get involved and we'll talk about it. But we design that in so that the product can improve. And to your point, Nicholson, we're using locked algorithms with periodic updates. Mm-hmm. Because another danger is, right, I think in all of our minds, the fear that the AI will get away from goodness. So let's take Watson for Oncology, for example. We track if the recommendations are used. So you probably haven't seen it, but it presents recommendations red, yellow, green. Green are the recommendations. It says, for your patient, the information we pulled from the health record, this is what we think, based on Memorial Sloan Kettering's guidance, the standard of care would be. The yellow are ones that this may be appropriate, but you may need to check further because maybe it's contraindicated in people who've had surgery or prior treatment and chemo, find out. And then red are, we don't recommend this. So we track that, and we're generally running in the older cancers where we've got a lot of experience, like breast cancer, where we launched first, up in the 90s. Well, we launched somewhere, and our concordance went way down. So what's going on? So we went in and we talked to us, we launched into a new country. So the physicians said, oh yeah, you are making the recommendation we wish we could use, but that drug isn't on our formulary. So it can't be first line of defense. We have to try one of your yellow applications first and then go red. So that was good. We modified the training and now that bumps out. But the fear, the danger would have been if the algorithm was live, you might get away from goodness because if you just let it say, oh, people aren't using this recommendation, it must not be as good. So that's where humans stay in, where reinforced learning is important. But all of that is great data that folks should be gathering and shouldn't really be afraid of.
I'm going to jump in with, first, thank you all. This is, so deeply fascinating. And one of the things that I heard repeated is this question about reproducibility and how we actually validate reproducibility. And, from when you first said, what is it that people actually want? And I was thinking about that. I think part of what they want is to know the reproducibility of the results as well. So I'm imagining I'm the physician, I get the articles that I can go through, but the articles don't map perfectly, right? And so there's a bunch of different articles. The algorithm actually, enables, or the, AI enables processing of that information such that even reading all of the articles wouldn't necessarily lead me to the same result. So first, how do you solve the problem of reproducibility without the transparency necessary to be able to share more? Meaning, how do you have external reproducibility? How do you have validation external to Watson such that Samir could be comfortable with it, or FDA could be comfortable with it, and be able to use that data without actually creating the kind of problems of trade secrets, et cetera?
Well, I think a little bit of what you're talking about is the interplay between what these solutions do and then what real world evidence really looks like, right? Because when I initially think of reproducibility, I think of, well, if you presented the same type of patient, would you get the same type of weighted recommendations? But I don't think that's what you're really driving at. I think you're driving at, how can I show that the results, if they picked the green treatments every time, were good results? Is that what you're focused
So it's
on?
both that it's reproducible in the sense of, if I trained a different AI using all the same papers, right, would I end up with a similar set of recommendations, or would I end up with a different set of recommendations? I would maybe end up with a very different set of recommendations, because it depends on what my assumptions are that are
Well,
going
actually,
in.
you would.
Right.
If you trained with MD Anderson or another cancer
I
center.
trained with Mayo instead of
Mayo.
training, right. But so the fact that I trained with them doesn't tell me everything that was used to train with them, right?
Correct.
And it doesn't give me, it just tells me, like, this is a really great institution, and so if it's all the right people saying all the right things and who took into account all of the right pieces of information, that's great. I'm not going to get the same results coming out of Mayo if I train with Mayo than if I train with Sloan. But part of how we,
That seems deeply weird, right?
Well,
I just want to point out, like, that seems bizarre and like maybe a wrong thing and like some sort of
Welcome to the
problem.
world of cancer treatment, though.
Yeah, okay.
That is one
Well, but we
feature.
show
Just wanted to flag
concordance
that.
as we move to other geos. So I don't think you get.
It's not wildly different.
They're not wildly different, but they are going to be around the margins. Some of cancer treatment is more art than science.
How aggressive will you be with either chemo or surgery? And the other thing with tracking concordance is the green recommendation may be the right one, but the patient may opt for another because they may have a personal preference. They may have seen their.
well, I suppose I've got two systems side by
Yep.
side, right? And one system says to me, here are the greens, and it turns out the greens are in the yellow in the other system, right? And they're and that's about it, right? Maybe then you would say, well, that's pretty close, right? There are different reasons why they're picking different things. But me as the physician, I want to know why, right? Why is it yellow here and green here? And how do I actually figure
I
that
think
out?
we keep getting back. So not just the answer of, well, that's how it was trained, is what you're saying, would be insufficient.
Right, but so if we want there to be not just the apathy, right, of like, this is what has been recommended, so therefore I'm going to go with it. But if we want there to be any physician involvement in training to be relevant, if I end up with two systems with very different results, or even if I end up with one system with results that may be counterintuitive to me, I want to know how it got to those results in order to help me with my decision making.
So in our specific case, as Julie mentioned, you will be able to pick through to the academic papers
Right.
that reference, the use of doxorubicin in small cell, blah, blah, blah. Is that perfect? No, but it would also be, if you were to interrogate your oncologist, I think, at some level, you'd have to just say, he'd say, well, no, I've seen patients like you, I've prescribed this course of treatment, and they seem to have gotten better.
But yeah, we have the transparency though to go to why is that the recommendation that they came to. So if
What
you
data support
if
that?
you were a doctor in
But not how each
Iowa.
of them were weighted, right?
Yeah.
Let me just jump in here. Samira, do you think that, for example, the source code would be necessary to have it there might be doctors who are competent to read the source code, and it would be necessary for them to really
Source code
trust
wouldn't
it.
tell you anything.
It wouldn't tell you.
So if I open my source code, it's load model, train, here's the math function, and end of it. That's not, it's all about how the data is conditioned, not just made available.
Right.
But even the same data that you're talking about,
Weighted differently.
Yeah.
not just weighted, no, I'm going one step further with that. If you have the same data set, I can condition the data set in different ways, the same algorithm, the same parameters, come up with different answers.
Right.
And that is because we are treating, so if I step back a little, and if you go into thinking about this in the system of engineering setup, we're thinking of this as a manufacturing process, where we expect the ISO 9000 to deliver you the product, the flooring sample the same way each time. You put this amount of steel inside, that temperature, that casting, and boom, every panel should come out the right way. And medicine, indeed, there is a degree of, well, yes, you need these drugs to cure this class of disease, except that in this patient, going back to Alam a little bit, had this prior condition before he got this. And therefore, this dose exactly will not necessarily apply. And then you come back to, I trust this doctor more. Why? Because gut feeling, he has seen more samples. I mean, we always had this, and we're trying to model this fuzziness, if you will, into a machine and say, well, can the machine actually replicate human fuzziness as a start? And then the next step is going to get better. I have a colleague at the University of California, Irvine, who is a cancer survivor. He is from India, like I am from, and he had a class of cancers for which there was one paper published about that class of cancers. And all the participants in the study were Finnish, white, blonde-haired, tall people. And he is brown-skinned, dark-haired Indian. And so you have this, you have a different population. And the doctor kept insisting that he take this drug pattern, and he said, well, how and what basis are you saying that? Now, fast forward, he got better, but they did a different dosing, and they discovered pattern shifts and so on. But he was arguing, as being a doctor's bad luck that this guy was a researcher, so he read papers for a living. So not he was an oncologist or anything, he was just a computer science person, but he read papers. So he said, show me the evidence. And so we come back to the same problem. We are asking humans to show the evidence. Well, then let's model it back to a machine and say, well, what factors did that algorithm, system of algorithms, really apply? And this is Sloan Kettering may be a sample of one, and it's not just Sloan Kettering. It's also you go to the oncology journals and or other experiments in the field, and then there's feedback, of course. So there's given all of this vagueness, and that's what we're trying to put through in the slides is that we don't know how to ask tough questions to actually measure reliably that these things are reproducible. They might well be reproducible, but are they really reliable? And there's a gap, and it's going to be through iterative cycles, I think, that we'll get somewhere meaningful.
Well, and that's where you look at real world
Arti?
evidence to see how are the outcomes looking.
So I think, Dinesh, you wanted to pipe in?
So I want to make maybe one or 2 points. One is that there was a mention of a collaborative and cooperative approach, and FDA CDRH has set up, is in the process of setting up the NEST, National Evaluation Systems for Health Technology. So this is a way for, it is, FDA is one of the members on the board, but it is a cooperative with all the stakeholders where this data, a wide variety of data can be placed, and it is not within sort of FDA's domain. So I just wanted to point that out, that is a very important tool in this pre-market, post-market balance that we are talking about. The second thing I want to say is real-world data and real-world evidence. So a long time ago, I was a chemist, and so if I were to write a sort of a simple one-line thing, on the left-hand side is real-world data, and what we want to get out of it is real-world evidence, and then you have in between is this, the data has to be high quality, is the algorithm correct, is it validated, how transparent it is, and one way of looking at it is a spectrum of things, and AI is sort of on the right-hand side, if one can call it that way, and machine learning is on the left-hand side. And so we have this spectrum of gradually going away from machine learning to deep learning and perhaps AI, natural language processing. Where we would be interested in is what claim is made, and so that would be a very important, for each individual product, what is the specific claim that is made. That would be very important from a regulatory perspective.
So I think one thing too, for regards to regulatory and as a society is, we talked about this at dinner last night, what is your comparator, right? So if your comparator is human performance, that's one thing to keep in mind. But another is don't hold the machine learning or the AI to a much higher standard than you would the human. And a good metaphor is drug approvals. We approve drugs every day that we don't know how they work. It can take years after a drug is launched before they actually understand the metabolites and how it's working and what it's actually doing. Instead, it's black box.
Right, but that's because we can't know rather than we do know and won't disclose it. Right? It's a little bit different.
No, eventually you could hold off approval until they've done all. So you can't launch and add 5 or 10
so
years.
that we know it's effective, and we've done studies that have been reproduced that are, and the studies are open, transparent, the methodology is open and transparent, so everybody understands how they were performed, but we simply don't know what the mechanism of action is necessarily that leads to the improvement.
Correct.
Right? That's different than not disclosing, and don't
Not necessarily.
So don't get me wrong. I recognize that there are many things that, for very good business reasons and to enable innovation, would not make sense to be utterly transparent. So don't hear me to be saying anything other than where do we draw the line, right? Because I think it's not if all of it will be made available, but just how much needs to be made available for us to be able to feel
I think we're
comfortable
agreeing,
with it.
because here's the metaphor I'm drawing. So you're developing your model, and as you're developing your model, you have training data, and that's your data, and you run 10-fold whatever or 20-fold, and you run it and you see how it did, and you do all your stats and all the terms, and you get a little better, you run it again, you get better. But at the very end, you have your validation data set. And that's where you're supposed to, and that's one of the things I train people to look out for. This is what you look for if you're looking for your algorithm. Make sure they don't use their training data in their validation set, because it's very easy to look good. But that is where you could start to impose standards, and they mentioned it with the driving. That could be the start of a validation set for industry. Similar with classification of adverse events. There's a lot. I mean, it's easy to say there'd be a ton of stuff you'd have to do because of all the different drugs in different ways. But that's where FDA could say, hey, as part of your final approval, you need to bang it against this set that is recognized as the training set. And you could say, oh, could they game the system? Well, yes and no, but if it ultimately did perform against that, that would provide reassurance and would also show you'd accomplished some of the main goals. So I'm not advocating complete closed door and, hey, you're going to get a recommendation and trust me, but it is definitely a journey where we want to get to things like that. Because as I said with the drugs, you do the clinical trials and you say, okay, these were the side effects. We don't necessarily know all the side effects yet. Some of them become unintended because same thing. One of the games for clinical trials is your inclusion-exclusion criteria, right? And if you want, you can kind of nudge it a little away from areas where, not for the right reasons, like we're not going to do pediatrics yet, but hey, we know this is going to make us look a little less better. Let's, maximize our output function. And when you get in the wild, you start to get those in, and that's where, unfortunately, sometimes bad things happen. I'm sure similar things will happen with some AI algorithms. And one last thing, advantages and a thing to look for in the level of regulation is there an expert in the driver's seat? So there are oncologists. And also, how urgent is the decision? So in cancer, yes, it is urgent, it's urgency, but it's not on the same level as if this were auto-dosing your insulin in case of a blood glucose spike. I would absolutely advocate a much tighter look if you're going to have an adaptive algorithm that's going to try and learn how someone lives and how they exercise, and it's going to auto-regulate your boluses of insulin. Absolutely needs more, and I've said as much to Dr. Shuren in trying to talk about the difference and ways to look at it. So, the amount of oversight and the level of urgency of the decision are two key guideposts to have.
So I feel the need to open it up, particularly because I see a former student of mine. I must be able to participate because students get priority at the school. So
Students.
it's all about the students, exactly. So Meredith.
So this is an area I'm very interested in and I'm currently writing on. But one of my questions is regarding the three approved devices that have been talked about the most are sort of in the radiological imaging space and image analysis space. I'm curious how you see that affecting the FDA's decisions and how they might treat devices that are different from this sort of long line of image processing from a completely different type of AI technology, whether that's influenced their comfort or discomfort with adding sort of this AI piece onto something they've dealt with for a long time.
You want to take it?
Me? I assume that was for Dinesh.
Oh, okay.
Is Dinesh on the line?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Somebody called. Can you? I'm sorry. Can you please repeat the question?
Sure, I'll try and make it shorter too this time. I'm wondering if the three sort of AI devices that have been approved so far have been in the sort of image analysis, radiological space, and I'm just curious about whether the FDA might have some more comfort with those kinds of devices, given the long history of their approvals with non-AI devices, and whether they might be different than future sort of non-image devices.
So something I should have said right up front is I work at the agency. These are my informed opinions. This is not a FDA formal position. So I don't want to get into trouble by saying this way or that way. Let me answer, or at least let me assist with that. Is computer-assisted diagnosis or detection has been around for us for a while. You can go back to 2012, I think, and there's a guidance document for that. So in general, if we are familiar, you look at it as like a four-corner thing. If we are, as you come closer and closer to the thing that we are comfortable with, and we have a long history or some history of approvals around that, then yes, one additional variable, it is much as with anybody, one additional variable can be evaluated much easily. If there are four different things coming at the same time, then it becomes a bigger challenge to evaluate. So that would be my my comment on that one. I hope I addressed your question to some degree. One additional thing I want to add is clinical risk to the patient is very important when we evaluate a product or when we set up our regulatory framework. And what we are trying to do is we are trying to, even in this sort of digital health space in general, what we are trying to do is to evaluate what part of the thing, the widget or whatever it is, what part of it is connected with the patient, what is the risk to the patient, and we are not going to regulate the entire thing. We are going to only focus on the aspect that is connected with the risk to the patient. And so, for mobile medical applications, there are some applications which are clearly, we regulate as medical devices. And then there are other mobile medical applications that are not medical devices or medical products. There is a gray area in between that these may be medical devices or medical products, but we are going to use what we call as enforcement discretion. That's a regulatory term. So we think we're going back to the point I made a minute ago, which is clinical risk to the patient. So that we will exercise our enforcement discretion because we think that the risk to the patient is minimum or low. Yeah.
I'll just tack on one really quick thing, which is to say, to the extent that image analysis is a technology that's already hard to draw explicit rules around, you might imagine that this is an area where it feels more natural to move to an AI where we've got, it's kind of like, I know it when I see it. We say that for pictures. We don't say like, I know a blood pressure rating's high when I see it, because we just give you a number. And to the extent that we say like, oh, it's always been and I know it when I see it, it's a little bit less weird for us to say the machine knows it when it sees it, rather than, well, like, tell us what the number is. I could imagine that being something, but I don't know.
So, quick echoing, I think you almost nailed it. I think you did nail it. Because it is in technical speak, it's deterministic. So an image for a lesion will look the same for that lesion for every, because you have a fixed subject size and the subject spatial location is going to look very, very close across. The variability is low. There is variability in sensors across manufacturers and such, but once an image is created, which is why you're seeing a lot more advances in the imaging side, even for labeling of objects in the general world images also. Language is much more fluid. It varies across professionals, so there is high degree of uncertainty there. And committing to a process right up front would be a great challenge. That said, you do see advances, subtle advances in AI in Google Home, Amazon's Alexa, Siri, and such into variable amounts, where you're seeing that it's becoming, it's there. It's you're already translating things. Gmail is answering, giving you responses that could be suggestions to your email. So it's not that it's absent. It's being tested on much less sensitive blocks. That said, Watson's doing that for probably literature coming from the journals, and so it's not. I think it's not an absent. It's just that some are in the spectrum of risk as clinical risk, as Dinesh said, and in general achievability, you have this. Some things are further along than others.
So we have one other person. Jerry, you've already spoken, so I'm going to have this person who's not spoken yet.
My name is Gina First. I just created a company. I guess I want to kind of take it back a little bit. So when we're talking with the transportation, board, there's so many data points. Like you can put a computer camera into an intersection, and there might be 1 million cars that go by, and there's a lot of data points that you can collect from that within a month. Now, this may be for Julie, the attorney, but when you're talking about health and data points, I would think that there would be HIPAA issues and the collaboration of different technologies, Watson, maybe another AI, or even different hospitals. You can't, you don't have as many data points because there's not that collaboration, or there may be some violations of privacy.
So, I mean, you obviously have to comply with HIPAA, right? And sometimes hospitals are more willing to share data than other situations. I mean, I think it depends, right? And I think there are things that can be done through de-identification with statistical opinions in particular, and that form of de-identification that can be used to help create larger pooled data sets to help with training data. But
I can give you a real life example.
yeah.
Yeah, so they mentioned quality and regulatory. I'm also the head of privacy and security for Watson Health. So I can tell you it's something we take very, very seriously. And one of our products is late and our GM isn't happy. But not late, but because of that, the concern with, it's a product we want to bring in that will read the EHR and help summarize for physicians a really nice snapshot of the patient in front of them. So they don't have to flip forward. It can give them all the salient points. But our limiting factor was or has been de-identified usable data. Because one thing I've maintained, they've done some work with synthetic data, which is great to get going. We've also held the line, you're not putting this out till we get 20,000 real records that are de-identified. So it's always in our mind, it's very concerned, and Julie's, is that your boss? Mm-hmm. Yes. Julie's boss, Ed, and I laugh. He's like, John, I am so tired of putting a stop on everything with just the term, do we have the usage rights? You know, because the researchers are researchers, and they're like, we got all this stuff, and we're like, yes, but you can't look at it.
Narrow rights and what you can do with it.
Show Julie or Ed that when whoever gave us this data gave us the rights to use it in that fashion. So I can assure you, that does come up all the time, and it's unfortunate because the research probably could do a lot of good stuff, but we're like, no, you're not getting access to it.
Well, and I think HIPAA actually does give us some flexibility. Some of the, and I know we're probably running out of time, but there's some really interesting articles coming out about GDPR, right? And it's more restrictive situation. And is that going to sort of stifle AI in the EU? And what does that mean for the EU? So I think there's some really interesting articles coming out about that right now, as you see an even stricter regulatory regime coming into effect around health data.
And GDPR is General Data Protection Regulation, which is coming out of the EU, and it's far more restrictive than anything in the US.
So on that note, everyone should go read the 300-page document that is GDPR and enjoy. Thank you very much.
Arti, can I say a word?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
From here, I want to say that one thing that we have realized, and we are trying to follow it as much as we can, is in this space, collaboration between technology, industry, regulated industry, academic faculty, other federal institutions, and FDA. And we find that is a very important tool because these are very innovative products, and we want to be sure that we want these products here in the U.S., and we want to support this innovation as much as possible. So that collaboration and things like this are very important. That has been our experience and our reading. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our panel.